And we have also made an effort to approach to issues through the lens of freedom of religion or belief and gender equality. Our Professor Zehra Yilmaz has been a great supporter to us throughout the planning of the conference. We would like to thank her very much for her efforts. We would like to thank all our moderators who kindly accepted our invitation to chair sessions, to all our panelists who have prepared their papers, their summaries. We would like to thank you all. We have received a great interest to the conference, which encourages us to work further in this area. Last but not least, I would like to thank Funda Tekin from the Freedom of Belief Initiative. She has made great efforts and dedicated all her time for the preparations of this conference. I do very much hope that this conference will help us to better understand the interconnections between these two rights and also to find out new synergy areas. We will now start the conference on freedom of religion or belief and gender equality in Turkey with our first session, opening session entitled Imagining Freedom of Religion or Belief and Gender Equality Together. Professor Emrah Bertil Oder will be the moderator. Professor Emrah Oder is the Dean and Professor of Constitutional Law at Koç University Law School. She received her PhD from the University of Cologne. She holds the UNESCO Chair for Gender Equality and Sustainable Development. Her research focuses on human rights, comparative constitutional law, gender studies, European Union law. Over to you.
Aynı zamanda inanç özgürlüğü girişimine Helsinki.
Thank you very much, Mine Hanım. And I would like to also thank yourselves, to the Freedom of Belief Initiative, as well as the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. I'm delighted to be here today with you, with such an audience. I take pride in being with such a select audience. Today we will talk about the intersectionality, but this intersectionality may also be telling in terms of conflicts, transformations, so I also hope to find some opportunities out there. As you have put it very correctly, every time we discuss the issue of freedom of religion or belief, we also focus on its relation to different aspects of gender equality. This also means that there is already an accumulated experience over there. However, on the other hand, every time we question gender equality, particularly representation of women in religious affairs or matters, or the status of women, or reproduction of laws or lawmaking in these processes, and the role of women in all of this. So these are the issues that are not debated at large by the public. So there is still a room for us to include more discussions around those issues. But all these presumptions may only reinforce biases and stereotypes. Therefore, if we are to approach gender equality through the prism of freedom of religion or belief, then there may be some issues that we should question, we should transform, and we should change, and we should explore new areas. I'm confident that throughout this conference, we will have in-depth discussions and we will have some creative responses to these outstanding issues, benefiting both from theory and from the case studies from different countries. And I'm very happy that in this opening session, we will be imagining freedom of religion or belief together with gender equality, and we have three distinguished speakers Professor Serpil Sancar. First of all, I would like to salute her, and very briefly, I would like to introduce her. Professor Dr. Serpil Sancar has been one of the pioneers on gender equality issues in Turkey, and at the same time, she has been one of the most prominent human rights defenders when it comes to women's issues. She has PhD of Political Science and Gender Studies and worked as a professor in Faculty of Political Science at Ankara University. She is a prominent feminist. She has worked on the theory of politics. She has published several academic articles and books on fundamental issues. She has been a very important figure also in civil society and academia. She has penned numerous reports, and in this way she contributed greatly to the creation of awareness or perception about all these issues. Kasum, one of the leading organizations in Turkey, that is the Women's Studies Center of Ankara University. So Sarpy Sancar is one of the founders of Kasum. Professor Sancar has also worked on the modernization of gender, men, women, and family. So she has come up with a trailblazer publication, The Journey of Ideology, Problematic Discourse, and the Masculine Discourse. So for many years, she has worked on these important research areas. I was not a student of Professor Sancar myself, but I'm sure we have many participants today who had this chance to be her students. So we can easily call her as our professor in a very heartfelt manner. So I would like to once again express how delighted and honored I am to have you in our session today. Our second speaker today is Associate Professor Nadia Sonneveld. She has an academic background in anthropology and law and Arabic. She has carried out academic research on those issues. She is a creative researcher, I have to say. I would like to once again welcome her. Nadia Sonneveld also is an associate professor at the Van Hoven Institute of Law, Governance and Society at Leiden University, the Netherlands, and we are very lucky to have her today with us because her research focuses particularly on the issues that are debated in Turkey. Today she will talk about freedom of belief or religion in Egypt, Boon or Bane. Our third speaker, Dr. Mary Jul Peterson, is a senior researcher and also a very creative researcher that inspires us at all times. She is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. So we feel very grateful that she is with us today and we will be benefiting from her research. Her research focuses on the intersections between religion and human rights, including the international promotion of the right to freedom of religion or belief and the role of faith-based NGOs in development cooperation and Islam and women's rights. She has published extensively on these issues. And Mary Jul Peterson will particularly focus on sustainable development goals and within this context, how we can question gender equality through the prism of freedom of religion or belief. So I don't want to keep the introduction very long. I would like to immediately give the floor to Professor Sancar.
Thank you very much for this a little bit exaggerated presentation of myself, as a matter of fact. First of all, I would like to thank the Freedom of Belief Initiative for this great organization. You have really made a lot of efforts to put it together. So a big thank you for them. And thank you for inviting me as well. I'm going to try to stick to my 15 minutes, and I'm going to talk about the relation between the state and religion in Turkey, and also talk about what happens in the intersectionality of gender and religion in Turkey and what we have to look at, especially in that regard. First of all, the state-religion relation in Turkey has some specificities. And I would like to say a few things about that. And while talking about that, it is very important that we look at Turkey in different historical periods. If we start with the foundation of the Republic and look at what kind of a state-religion relation there is in Turkey, a lot of people would say, for example, that it is quite similar to the French model. However, I believe that there's a much different structure in place. When you look at the state-religion relation in the Republic, abolition of the caliphate and organizing the Islamic religion that is loyal to the new nation state that is being built, we see that the state was organized along those lines. In a way, a sort of a version of Sunni Islam that is being organized, that is going to be loyal to the modern nation state that is being built. And the main institution that is instrumental in that is the Presidency of Religious Affairs in Turkey, that is loyal to the state, that is striving for the sustainability of the state, and that is trying to keep religion out of public life and to some extent private life as well. This could be similar to Rousseau's concept of civilian religion or civil religion. A religion that is serving the state but also leaves the faith to the private lives of the citizens and organizes the religious organizations so that they're going to be under the monopoly of the state. Therefore, the mosques or the temples being supported by the state to some extent, and getting rid of religious organizations or structures that would not be loyal to the state. The religion that has been organized by the Presidency of Religious Affairs with the transition to the multi-party state has gone through a very important transition. So the multi-party state, Turkey switched to it in about 1950. And with that, a very important part enters into the equation, which are the conservative electorate that becomes part of this equation after the 1950s. Around that time, the religious organization turns away from the civic religion that is loyal to the perpetuity of the state, a sort of a Sunni Islam that is being organized by the Presidency of Religious Affairs. So this is like the religion of the presidency, as a matter of fact. And with that period going up until 2000s and 2010s, there are different transformations that the religious organization goes through in Turkey, but the main dimension is that the public is turned more religious by the hands of the presidency, through religious education, through lodges, and the electorate is in a way being Sunniized or turned more religious, and that is part of a political stratagem. So what is this Presidency of Religious Affairs religion? So it is based on Sunni Islam, and it is a rendition of Sunni Islam in a simplistic way, so that it is acquired by the students in a simpler way, and also the relations between the with these different lodges, and also developing relations with them in public structures as well. The main point here is that apart from Sunni Islam, like other sects like Alevism, for example, or other religions like Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, are sort of put lower in a priority order, and the faiths apart from Sunni Islam are kept away from the public sphere and are given a very restricted role in civic life, and are not granted certain fundamental freedoms. This kind of a model has been transformed recently. I'll just say a few things about that, just to define the beast, so to speak. Especially in early 2000s and also after 2010s as well, a sort of a new public reorganization appeared that I call mosque politics. So what is the main issue about this period? Through mosques and as also congregations, there are commercial sociological groups that are being formed in the same networks. So it is sort of an integration. It's a sort of an economic commercial integration with involving politics and involving congregations. And that is being supported politically. These kinds of structures are provided priority concessional financing from the public purse as well. And this model, with the public financing support, is creating a monopoly in the public sphere as far as faith is concerned. If we take a snapshot of today's situation, what do we see? First of all, apart from Sunni Islam and Hanafi Islam, many of the other faith groups are kept away from freedoms in the public sphere. I mean, if we ask that kind of a question, can we answer it in the affirmative? No. And the other interpretations of Sunni Islam, apart from the one that is being espoused by the Presidency of Religious Affairs, are there also existent in the public sphere? Not really. And another question that we have to ask is there any liberty for atheism, for atheists? Is there sort of protection in terms of faith for them? Not really. We can't really answer that question in the affirmative either. In this period, what really needs to be highlighted, I think, is that Sunni Islam has had a lot of visibility with the discourse and the actors that it has in the public sphere, and also a demand for legitimization and immunity for those people and for that faith. Therefore, it is, in a way, trying to dominate the public sphere, and also is asking for an immunity, is trying to curb criticism and even criminalize criticism. In that respect, Kazanova's public religion or post-secularism concepts would be important here, I think, but they still fall short of talking about the real situation in Turkey, I think, because the public actors, the Sunni actors in Turkey, are having a claim for superiority, for priority, and also determinacy as well, and also declaring their own faith, their own opinions as sacred. And legal and political measures are being taken to keep that holy. From that, if you look at state, religion, relation, and gender in Turkey, I believe that when religious beliefs are concerned in Turkey, and obviously I'm mostly talking about the Sunni Islam here, not the other faith groups, I believe that there is a difference between male religiosity and female religiosity. The female religiosity, or women practicing Sunni Islam, is more sort of metaphysical, more folk Islam in a way, as a matter of fact, through the lodges, or, for example, the collective prayers in houses, and that kind of a socialization. And it's focused on more metaphysical aspects of the religion. But for the male religiosity, I believe that there are different networks. It's much more rational, it's much more interest-driven, it involves commercial groups, it involves political positions. So the male religiosity is organized in that way. Therefore, the gender regime is striking in terms of the participation in the religious rituals of males and females. So there's a differentiation, first of all, in that. Therefore, in terms of gender, this is a sort of a social and political dynamic that is created by the gender differences, and this has to be taken into consideration because of that, first of all. And when you talk about gender equality and the intersectionality of that with the freedom of religion and belief, first of all, we have to talk about the head veil issue, I think. And then how the Presidency of Religious Affairs looks at gender equality. So I'd like to finish with that, if I may. The head veil issue in Turkey has been monitored by the whole world, as a matter of fact, like starting from the 1990s, for example, the veiled university students trying to get into university, their protests. So these protests by young women, and also the 28th of February process. The males of these religious groups, the men of these religious groups, have also supported that as well. Therefore, it was not only a sort of a political protest put on by the women. And obviously, there were also some people who were individually putting up a fight as well, as not part of a group. However, it was a sort of a rebellion against these restrictions, so that the women with veils could have more liberty. And especially the public restrictions and also in certain areas, the restrictions in civil society as well on the veil were objected to, and obviously that was a very righteous objection. This process ended with the liberalization of the head veil. However, the veil issue and its ramifications have continued up until now, and it's a political phenomenon in that regard. It has certain different layers, and obviously it is very difficult to go into all of these layers at the moment, but in this process, feminists and women's rights advocates in Turkey supported the liberalization of the veil. Against some women who may be called Kemalists or Republicans. However, after this process, how was the liberalization practiced in Turkey in terms of women, especially in the AKP period? Some veiled women have been prioritized in the public sphere and have been made visible, especially by the TV managers, for example, TV show producers. That kind of a visibility has also gone into politics as well, in justice, becoming judges, veiled women becoming judges, prosecutors, MPs. Obviously, we need to ask a question here, and that is, each veiled woman coming to an important position, have they come there on meritocracy because they merited it, or because they had a veil on and the person making the decision had that kind of faith and supported veiled women? I believe that we have to investigate that issue. Could we say, for example, that, I mean, it's very difficult to say at the moment, for example, that veiled women have come to those positions just because of meritocracy, because the veil was a very important symbol of a political fight, of political Islam in Turkey. So the veil is a sort of a cultural, has stopped being a cultural habitus of women in Turkey, but rather has turned into a symbol of political Islam. But obviously, political Islam could not dominate the veil on its own, because there are much more radical, critical, veiled women as well. Islamic feminists have appeared, and I believe that they need to be highlighted as well. However, what I would like to say here is that the liberalization of the veil has brought some women into important posts, into important positions. They have become ministers of the state, for example. They have become judges in high courts. But a lot of a great section of those women, because the veil was liberalized, was sort of closed down or sort of shut down from some sections of society. We know, for example, that while the veil liberalization really liberalized some women, it also shut down or closed down into their houses some women. So we had that kind of a reversal effect at some point as well. Lastly, the Presidency of Religious Affairs in that period, what kind of a gender regime it espoused? If you look at that, I think this is a very important issue that we need to discuss in detail, and I talk about this in my books and papers as well. The presidency after 2010 went through a great transformation. So that is the sort of the second era of AKP, and it's one of the founding mechanisms of that period. The law about the presidency of religious affairs changes, and it says that it is also given the mandate of guiding the family and the women in that law, in that new amendment in the law. And in each branch of the presidency of religious affairs, there is a family and women branch in all the provinces. And these branches, these sections, provide sort of religious guidance, religious advice to women and family, and talk about the problems of being a woman, domestic violence, divorce, custody of children, alimonies, or having abortions. On many of these different issues, they provide guidance. To a great extent, in many important issues, they go against the civic law, the civil law in Turkey. For example, they say that abortion is forbidden in the religion. Or, for example, they say that in vitro fertilization is a sin for a woman that is not married. Or, for example, the custody of children should be with the women until they're 7 years old, and after that, the father should take over. So they make those kinds of interpretations that are against women's rights, as a matter of fact. But are they mandatory? Do you have to do it? No, obviously. But if you say this is in a position of authority in religion, obviously that carries a certain weight. And also, a very important transformation that the Presidency of Religious Affairs went through is that the Presidency of Religious Affairs is completely managed by men. The muftis, the president, the imams in the mosques. Therefore, anybody who has the interpretive authority is male. But all of the sermons of the presidency, all of the courses that they provide, they are mostly towards or aiming at women and girls. About like 60% or 70% of them. So as a matter of fact, the situation is at the moment is that those who make the interpretations and announcements are male, and those receiving them are female. And we can obviously talk about the Imam schools or the seminaries in Turkey. We can count them in as well. So there are about also 80 faculties of theology in universities in Turkey as well, and many of the faculty staff there are male, like only 5% of the faculty staff are women, but a great majority of the bachelor students or the pre-bachelor students are women, are girls. So there is a sort of a gender hierarchy here as well. The decision makers are male, but the students are female. Therefore, this is in a way making women more religious. It is a sort of a re-doctrinization of women about religion in Quran courses and even at secondary schools. And we also see this in the number of women that we have in the dormitories of those schools as well. When you look at the technical and vocational education schools and the imamatifs, for example, we see that the number of them going to religious schools is about 2 or 3 times higher than that of technical and vocational education schools. And they are provided free of charge dormitory space as well, so that they're going to continue their education in those schools. So these are very important phenomena, in my opinion. Last sentence, after all that explanation, in terms of gender equality, when you look at Turkey, what can we say? Secularism or laicite is more about gender equality than it has ever become so, I think. it's about protecting gender equality at the moment. The political sphere has been dominated by religious Sunni Islam actors, and religious immunities and superiorities have been created. And the fact that that happened makes us question whether the state-religion relation has now sort of turned into a situation where the state is dominated by religion than the other way around, as it was before. I believe that that has to be questioned in terms of gender equality as well. I'm going to finish up here. Thank you very much. Maybe we can discuss this later on with questions. Thank you.
Üzerinde tartışılacak birçok tabii nokta da açmış oldunuz.
Thank you very much, Professor Sancar. In fact, you have pointed out to very important issues and questions. I have taken my notes, and I believe by the end of the session, we will have some time for a Q&A session. So we will kindly ask you to use the Q&A button that you will see in your Zoom screen for all your questions. So if you can post your questions through this Q&A button, then we will have a better chance of not missing your question. And now we will continue with Professor Nadia Sonneveld. Over to you.
Yes, hello, good morning. I will first take a minute to share my screen, so please bear with me. Is the PowerPoint visible? Could you please confirm? Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. No, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for, I would like to thank the organizers for extending this invitation to me. And I feel very, very honored to speak at this conference and to be allowed to make a small contribution by focusing on a case outside of Turkey. And in this way, be able to add a comparative perspective. Today I will speak about freedom of religion in Egypt, Boon or Bane, and we will see which one applies to the case of Egypt as we go through this presentation. And freedom of religion has, of course, many facets, and we all know the first one, the right or the freedom to practice your religion. And there is also the right, the freedom to change your religion, but there is also this negative aspect, the right to not profess or practice any religion or belief. And in this presentation, I would like to pay attention to all three aspects in the context of Egyptian family law. But because of the time constraints, it will be very short and brief. So if you have any questions, I look forward to them in the Q&A. And first of all, let me make it clear that as I was already introduced by, I have a social legal background. I work at the Van Vollenhoven Institute for Law, Governance and Society, and there we practice a law and society approach. So we don't only look at law in the books, but we also want to know how is law being applied in practice. So the presentation today will be grounded in this law and society approach. Sorry. First of all, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction into the Ottoman millet system. And there is some sort of link to the case of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire preceding it. Then I would like to move on to freedom of religion in Egypt, law in the books, and to be followed by law in practice. How does that work out in practice? I decided to start with this cartoon, and it was published in an Egyptian national newspaper in January 2000. And the husband, the poor and small husband washing up, is saying to his big wife, "This is not a chola divorce. This is the rule of the strong over the weak." And I don't know, I'm just very curious. Is there anyone who knows what this cartoon is about? Please feel free to unmute. Let me just have a very quick look at the chat. No. Okay. Sorry. So this cartoon was published in the context of the introduction of a reform of Muslim family law in January 2000. And one of the most controversial law provisions was about this. By the way, the law was the first law of the new millennium. So it was also very symbolic in the way the Egyptian government at that time wanted to give shape to the protection and of women and gender equality. So the most controversial provision was called chola. And it means, in the Egyptian context at least, that a woman can ask for a divorce unilaterally, so without the consent of her husband, and on a no-fault base. So she doesn't need to show that she has good grounds for the divorce. And I would argue that this cartoon, that it covers, or that it contains references to all three aspects of freedom of religion. Because here, if you ask the question, can you practice your religion? Then the answer is yes. Because both the husband and the wife can practice their Muslim-based family law in the field of divorce in this case. The chola divorce, however, is a divorce provision that only applies to Muslim women and not to non-Muslims. So to come to this question, can you change your religion? So if a Coptic Egyptian woman thinks like, wow, that sounds really good, and I'm really fed up with my husband, can I change my religion and for the rest of my life fall under the provisions of Muslim family law? Then the answer in short is yes. Is the other way around possible? Can Muslims become Christians? Then the answer is no, and I will explain that in more detail later. The third aspect of freedom of religion or belief, is it possible to not profess your religion or your belief? And then the answer, especially in the field of family law, is basically no. Because family law in Egypt is religion-based. There is nothing outside of it. And in what follows, I would like to explain how this is possible. Okay, so here we pay attention to the Ottoman millet system. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but during the Ottoman period, it was possible for confessional communities, so for non-Muslims or mainly non-Muslims, to deal with family law issues in an autonomous way. And they would have their own religious courts and their own religious authorities who would apply the rules and execute rulings. Egypt has been part of the Ottoman Empire for a long, long time. And so it inherited this Ottoman millet system. And in the post-Ottoman period in Egypt, it was used to give the non-Muslim communities legislative and judicial authority before 1955. So they could both had the freedom to make their own laws and to apply them because there were religious courts. This changed after 1955 under then President Nasser because the religious courts were abolished, so the non-Muslims community still had the freedom to make their own laws, but they would be applied in national courthouses by secular trained judges. And why did Nasser abolish the religious courts? Because he considered them to be remnants of foreign occupation. So read Ottoman occupation. Well, the result is until this day that in Egypt you have one Muslim law of marriage and divorce, you have six Christian laws of marriage and divorce, and one Jewish law of marriage and divorce. And it should be noted that the Jewish community in Egypt is really small. Christians form a minority of, well, it's disputed, but let's say between 5, 10, 15% of the population, which is still a significant number because the Egyptian population counts over 100 million inhabitants. And within the Christian denominations, Coptic Orthodox Egyptians form by far the largest community. So given the fact that all laws are religion-based, how does that impact on freedom of religion or belief? And how does that affect gender equality? Well, first of all, law in the books. According to the new Constitution of 2014, freedom of belief is absolute. Yeah, the freedom of practicing religious rituals and establishing places of worship for the followers of revealed religions is a right organized by law. And revealed religions in Egypt refers to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And to continue law in the book story, Article 2 of the Constitution of 2014, but it has been present in the Egyptian Constitution since 1980, is that Islam is the religion of the state, and the principles of Islamic Sharia are the main sources of the main source of legislation. Then in 2014, a new article was included, Article 3, and it says that the principles, that there is an exception for non-Muslims, but only in the field of family law. Yeah, so the principles of Islamic Sharia apply only in the field of family law. Yeah, because the principles of the laws of Egyptian Christians and Jews are the main sources of laws regulating their personal status, which is the same as family law, and also their religious affairs and the selection of spiritual leaders. So for the first time in Egypt's history, the church was constitutionally designated the guardian of Christians in matters of family law. And it should be mentioned that in Egypt, all other fields of law are secular based. So criminal law, for example, is based on Italian law. There's a lot of laws that are based on French law codes, etc. So it's really the field of family law that has remained religion based. So now you could question whether this Article 3, how Coptic Christians, the largest Christian community in Egypt, how they feel about it. Well, some obviously are very happy about it, because in the context of freedom of religion, it gives them a lot of freedom to practice the religion according to the principles of their religion. But a lot of other Copts are very unhappy about this. And why is that? I hope you can, yeah. And this newspaper article and many others with the more or less the same context was published in 2017, but there have been the debate has been going on for decades, because for Coptic Christians, it's very difficult to divorce. Both men and women need to prove that that the other spouse committed adultery or that the other spouse committed apostasy. And proving adultery is not easy, and it's the only ground you have to get a divorce and to be able to remarry. So the result of course, is that given that there is freedom to change your religion, that many Coptic Christians converted, both men and women, to Islam to be able to get that divorce. Were they able to convert back to Christianity after they were able to obtain the divorce? In the beginning, no, but later the higher courts gave, in some cases, with a lot of difficulties, these people the possibility to convert back to Christianity. Is it possible for an Egyptian Muslim, a person who is born as a Muslim, to convert back to Christianity? Then the answer is no. There is no law provision that explicitly forbids it. But the Egyptian courts have ruled that because of Article 2 of the Constitution that says that the principles of Islamic Sharia are the main source of legislation, and because of Article 19.8 of the Penal Code that penalizes blasphemy, that conversion from Islam to Christianity cannot be allowed. So how does that work out in practice? Well, here we see something very interesting, because as I said, a lot of Egyptian Copts are very unhappy about the fact that now they have the freedom of religion. They can practice their religion. Family law is based on their religion, but they cannot divorce because they do not have the authority to deviate from the way their religious authorities define the principles of their religion. And so a number of them came together in a group called Copt 38, and they went to several places in Cairo, the parliament, Al-Azhar, and other places, saying that the proposed Article 3 that gave the religious leaders a lot more power in personal status affairs was unconstitutional, since it contradicted Article 2. And this Article 2 reaffirmed that the principles of Islamic Sharia are the principal source of legislation. And they, the Copt 38, continued by arguing that Article 3 would turn Orthodox Copts into second-rate citizens by forcing them to convert to Islam in order to have their affairs adjudicated in accordance with the principal source of legislation. So what they were asking for is Islamic law in the field of family law to be applied to them without the need to convert to Islam. Now I'm coming to the end of my presentation and to the third aspect of freedom of religion. Let's see. I think here, I don't know if you can see it, but I don't see a lot here. Yeah. Because what is interesting here is that, well, it's something that scholars have called the closure of the normative field. So instead of developing a secular discourse, these Copt 38 have framed their demands within the framework of two dominant normative discourses. Yeah? So they frame their demands within the framework of religious language, the language of Islamic Sharia, and the language of Christian Sharia. So the church authorized discourse of fighting against lust and illicit relations, of fighting against adultery. So the fact that you cannot even suggest the introduction of a secular form of family law says a lot about freedom of religion and belief in Egypt. So here's my conclusion, or my preliminary conclusion, and I'll be very interested in hearing what questions you might have, or what suggestions you might have. But freedom of religion in Egypt, Boon or Bane? Can you practice your religion? Yes. I mean, it's constitutionally enshrined, but only if you belong to one of the three revealed religions. Yeah. Yes, you can practice your religion because the field of family law is religion-based. So the most intimate aspects of your life are governed by religion. Can you change your religion? Well, we saw that from moving from Christianity to Islam is possible. I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy. It comes with a lot of complications too, but it's compared to conversion from Islam to Christianity, it's a lot easier. But the negative aspect, the right to not profess or practice your religion, for example, in the field of family law, is that possible? And the answer here is no. You cannot opt for secular family law. There is a closure of the normative field. So freedom of religion in Egypt comes with a lot of limits. And yeah, I would like to end my presentation here, and I look forward to further discussion.
Professor Sonneveld'e çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much, Professor Sonneveld. The minority statuses in Muslim majority countries and them making their own claims and demands, and to be able to do that using a religion-infused language also provides another plethora of discussions as well, because around the world nowadays,
özellikle Avrupa'ya dönük çalışmalar ve buradaki
because generally around the world people are talking about the Muslim minorities in Europe especially, but Professor Sonneveld's presentation has shown a very important perspective for us in a Muslim majority population, people of others' faith, like Coptic Christians, for example. What is their status, the constitutional problems to do with them, and them making the necessary, making the demands they see necessary. The last presentation is by Dr. Mary Jul Peterson, and she's going to talk about the freedom of religion or belief, gender equality, and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this really important conference. So I will speak a little bit more generally about the relationship between freedom of religion or belief and gender equality in the context of the SDGs. So historically, rights related to freedom of religion or belief and gender equality have often been seen to be in contradiction with one another. And people who work for the promotion of respectively freedom of religion and gender equality rarely work together. In fact, sometimes they work against one another. And underlying this misperception of a clash or a conflict between the two sets of rights is very often an understanding of freedom of religion or belief as a right that protects religion, and typically conservative patriarchal religion. And for some, that means that freedom of religion or belief is an inherent obstacle to achieving gender equality. And for others, gender equality is seen as a threat to the protection of religious values and practices. But from a human rights perspective, which is what I come from, freedom of religion or belief is not about protection of conservative or patriarchal religious traditions and values. In fact, it's not about protection of religion at all. It's about protecting the individual's right to have, to adopt, to change or leave a religion or belief, or as we just heard, to not have a religion or belief at all, to manifest and practice their religion or belief alone or in community with others, and to be free from coercion and discrimination on the grounds of their religion or belief. This is the core of the right to freedom of religion or belief. And all these things obviously also include women's right to interpret and practice their religion the way they believe is true, even when this goes against the orthodoxy of the religious community. So seen as such, freedom of religion or belief can actually be a tool to empower people in their struggles for gender equality and non-discrimination. Also, freedom of religion or belief can never be used to justify violations of women's rights. While the right to have or not have a religion or belief can never be limited, the right to manifest and practice this religion or belief can and should be limited in certain circumstances. Most importantly, when the practices and manifestations of some people violate the rights and freedoms of others. So in other words, female genital mutilation, honor killings, gender-based violence, and other harmful practices that are sometimes justified in the name of religion are obviously not protected by the right to freedom of religion or belief. In fact, the state has an obligation to prevent and criminalize such practices. So the relationship between rights related to freedom of religion or belief and gender equality is not always straightforward. They can and do sometimes collide, as many other sets of rights do, and I'll get back to that later. But there's no inherent contradiction between the two, and that is an important point. An understanding of the interconnectedness and interdependency of freedom of religion or belief and gender equality is not just a question of fluffy human rights norms. If we maintain an antagonistic relationship between the two, it will have very real consequences for the many millions of people who are discriminated against on the grounds of both religion and gender. Not only in terms of legal protection gaps, but also in terms of lack of attention and sensitivity to their needs, demands, experiences, and specific vulnerabilities. So a few years ago, I was involved in an expert consultation process on freedom of religion or belief and gender equality in the context of the SDGs. The process brought together 70 experts from 40 different countries who shared their experiences, insights, and analysis of the relationship between freedom of religion and belief and gender equality in different thematic contexts. So more specifically, we identified some of the most common types of challenges in the areas of health, education, climate change, and access to justice. And we look not only at legal discrimination, but also discrimination in state policies and practices, and among non-state actors and in broader society. And on the basis of this consultation, we wrote a report, which, as Mina said, has also been translated into Turkish. So in our analysis of the relationship between freedom of religion and belief and gender equality, we found that most challenges seem to be about violations of both freedom of religion or belief and gender equality, rather than about a clash between the two. So often we found gender-based and religiously based discrimination exist in tandem, a sort of parallel discrimination. And there's a lot of research actually showing a strong correlation between countries with high restrictions on religion and low protection of gender equality. So the challenges that women, girls, LGBTIQ persons, and religious minorities face in terms of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion are often similar. And often, although certainly not always, the drivers and root causes of these challenges are the same. So in relation to education, for instance, we found similar patterns of gender and religiously based discrimination in curricula, in textbooks, and in teaching. Both women, girls, LGBTIQ persons, and religious minorities are often subject to stereotyping and stigmatization, or they're simply ignored in school education. Obligatory religious instruction is an obvious example. Here, focus will often be exclusively on the majority religion, and minority traditions and beliefs are omitted or stigmatized. And likewise, religious instruction will often perpetuate stereotyped and discriminatory gender roles, leaving little room for alternative interpretations. As in Hungary, where the official textbooks on religion state that homosexuality is, and I quote, a serious deadly sin. So in such cases, women, girls, and LGBTIQ persons from religious or belief minorities are victims of double discrimination. But sometimes we found that challenges intersect in the sense that religiously based discrimination has certain gendered consequences, and gender-based discrimination has certain consequences for religious minorities, merging into new forms of discrimination and making people victims of triple discrimination. So religious discrimination often affects women, girls, and LGBTIQ persons from religious or belief minorities in different ways than it affects men and boys from the same minority. And gender-based discrimination affects women, girls, and LGBTIQ persons from religious minorities in different ways than it affects women, girls, and LGBTIQ persons from the majority religion. So let me give a few examples. Oppression and harassment of religious minorities often involves systematic gender-based violence as a strategy for elimination or contamination of the community, or as a tool for retaliation and revenge. So in China, for instance, women from the Muslim Uyghur minority are allegedly subject to rape and forced sterilization in the so-called re-education camps, where hundreds of thousands of people are detained solely because of their religious affiliation. So they are experiencing a different kind of religious oppression than the male representatives from the same religious minority. Religious family law is another example. We have already heard Dr. Nadia talk about this. So when family laws restrict women's right to marriage or custody of their children on the basis of their religious affiliation, these laws constitute a violation not only of women's right to equality and non-discrimination, but also of their right to freedom of religion or belief and non-discrimination on the grounds of religion. So in Sudan, for instance, the law stipulates that in custody dispute cases where the father is Muslim and the mother is non-Muslim, courts should grant custody to the father if there is concern that the mother will raise the child in a religion other than Islam. There are also many examples of more indirect, implicit discrimination and inequalities. For instance, in many countries, government doesn't prioritize schools in areas with a predominance of religious minorities, resulting in inadequate and unsafe education infrastructure. And that obviously affects both boys and girls from these minorities, but girls may suffer disproportionately. When schools are few and far between, this means that the journey to school may be long, and that will often lead parents to keep their daughters at home out of fear of harassment and violence on the way to school. So in our analysis, we also identified situations in which the right to FORB and gender equality actually do seem to clash, especially in the area of health. An often mentioned example concerns conscientious objection or refusal to provide services related to sexual and reproductive health. So in some countries where abortion is legal, medical staff has the right to refuse participation in abortion-related services. And typically this right will also extend to other forms of reproductive health care, including assisted reproductive technologies, prenatal diagnosis, contraception, and sterilization. And while some people consider conscientious objection to abortion an essential part of freedom of religion, others note that this practice may compromise women's right to health. That's especially the case in situations where the vast majority of healthcare providers opt for conscientious objection. In Italy, for instance, as many as 7 out of 10 gynecologists refuse to carry out abortion services. Similarly, in Uruguay and Poland, there are regions where access to abortion is severely restricted because of conscience clauses. So that means that even if women have a legal right to abortion in these countries, in practice it is very difficult and in some cases impossible for them to make use of this right. So even in these cases, which seem like a clear-cut example of conflict between freedom of religion and gender equality, the relationship is actually far more complex than that. Because there is in fact nothing that hinders the use of freedom of religion or belief as an argument for sexual and reproductive health rights, including abortion. Freedom of religion or belief is, as noted by the former UN Special Rapporteur Heiner Bielefeld, and I quote, a norm to which liberals and conservatives, feminists and traditionalists, and others can refer to in order to promote their various and often conflicting religious or belief-related concerns, including conflicting interests and views in the field of religious traditions and gender issues. And there are actually many faith-based gender equality activists who see women's right to self-determination as an important part of their religious freedom. In the US, for instance, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice explicitly refers to freedom of religion or belief in their advocacy for sexual and reproductive health rights. For them, freedom of religion or belief is about guaranteeing the right of all people to exercise their conscience to make their own reproductive health decisions without shame or stigma. So to sum up, the relationship between freedom of religion or belief and gender equality is complex. There are no inherent contradictions between the two human rights norms, but there are concrete instances of conflict or conflicting prioritizations, as is the case with many other rights. But in most cases, challenges seem to concern both freedom of religion or belief and gender equality, whether in the form of parallel or similar challenges to both, or in the form of intersecting types of discrimination. And it's important to understand this relationship and address challenges in ways that take into account these parallel and intersecting forms of discrimination. For many people around the world, standalone or isolated efforts to counter either gender discrimination or religious discrimination will not be able to provide adequate responses to the challenges they face, whether it's gender-based violence, religious family laws, stereotyping and bias in the education system, or lack of access to sexual and reproductive health rights, to mention only a few examples. So in the report, we present a range of recommendations and concrete ideas for a more comprehensive approach to freedom of religion or belief and gender equality, both generally and in relation to the specific thematic areas that we analyzed. And some of our key recommendations include more systematic and consistent analysis and clarification of norms among UN actors, in particular the various treaty bodies and special procedures, establishment of spaces for dialogue, relation building and cooperation between advocates of freedom of religion and advocates of gender equality, encouraging greater attention to synergies in concrete programs and projects. We also recommended strengthening attention to religious discrimination and the gendered aspects of this in the SDG framework and in broader efforts for human rights development and democratization. And we recommended more research and disaggregated data collection on religious discrimination and intersections with gender discrimination. I'll not go through all these, but I'll just highlight one overall and cross-cutting recommendation as the last thing in my presentation, and that is the need for a nuanced, inclusive approach to religion and religious actors in efforts to promote freedom of religion and gender equality. So religious actors are not just victims or perpetrators of discrimination and human rights violations. They are both, and sometimes simultaneously. Among some religious freedom activists, there has been a tendency to focus on religious minorities only as victims, which they obviously are. But little attention has been paid to the gender discrimination and inequalities that take place within these communities. Religious minorities can, just like their majority counterparts, be highly patriarchal, with practices and traditions that run counter to gender equality norms and principles. Conversely, some women's rights and gender equality activists have tended to see religion primarily as a source of harmful practices, discrimination, and patriarchy, overlooking the important role that religion can and often does play as a source of empowerment and inspiration in people's struggles for equality and justice. All over the world, people of faith work in different ways to promote gender-sensitive interpretations of religious texts and practices, insisting on the voice and agency of women and social minorities within their religion. That includes people who consider themselves religious feminists, but also many others who prefer to avoid this labeling but share the same goals of equality, pluralism, and non-discrimination. And often people of faith who work for gender equality are under severe pressure, both from parts of their own religious community who may find their gender-sensitive religious interpretations heretic or even blasphemous, and from secular women's rights advocates who suspect that their faith-based approach will contribute to legitimizing discriminatory religious norms and practices. So these actors merit particular attention and encouragement. Their insistence on their right to freedom of religion or belief is important, not because they have more right to freedom of religion than others, but because they have been silent for so long. Freedom of religion or belief protects all individuals and groups' right to interpret and practice their religion or belief. That includes conservative religious actors who argue for traditional religious values. It includes secular women's rights actors who reject religion as inherently patriarchal. And it includes religious actors who find inspiration and strength in their religion to fight for gender equality and non-discrimination. Thank you.
Dr. Peterson'a çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Aslında toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği, din ve inanç özgürlüğü, sürdürülebilir kalkınma hedefleri bağlamında...
Thank you very much, Ms. Petersen, Professor Petersen. You have mentioned the perceived conflicting nature between these two rights, and you have mentioned the importance of collecting data. You have looked into this conflict situations, and it was a very comprehensive presentation. These are very important issues and great problems, obviously. However, probably the most striking feature of Professor Peterson's presentation was that this multi-stakeholder environment provides a diversity in terms of freedom of religion and belief, and also has the possibility for more nuanced solutions in this nexus between this freedom and gender equality. So after this part, I'm going to go into the questions and answers. Thank you very much for all the comments that have been shared in the question and answer session. First of all, there are two questions for Sarpil, and also there are some questions in the chat box as well. I'm going to ask all of that. But first of all, I believe that Dr. Sonneveld and Dr. Petersen are going to have very important comments about these questions as well.
I believe the first question may be responded by Professor Sancar. We have an anonymous attendee asking about the female-male ratio in Turkey's religious education, particularly in theology. And we have a second question, which raises the issue of women with headscarves being the victims. In fact, there are so many other segments of society, including Alevi women and other minority groups facing problems, and indeed the compulsory or mandatory religious classes being instrumentalized as an apparatus for violence and being imposed on non-Sunnis. So also I would like to note the diversity within Islam and a very significant community, Alevis, and their victimization. There is yet another question about the presidency of religious authority, religious affairs. If the presidency and its administration is made up of women primarily, how would it be different? And here is my personal question to all our panelists. Is there any connection between all these discussions we have now and what's happening all around? For instance, Turkey took the decision to pull out of the Istanbul Convention. This has not only generated a discourse, but a tangible policy. So this is what is happening right now. And in established democracies, in Council of Europe member states, or in societies where women's movements are strong, we can still see such a tendency. So there is this gender backlash. And considering this gender backlash, where do we stand on freedom of belief or religion? What kind of an approach we should adopt here? Thank you. Thank you very much. To our moderator, Professor Bertil, Oder. Let me try to respond very quickly. First of all, I have shared a link in the chat box about the about the statistics, about the male-female ratios in religious education, and also in these links you can find information both in English and in Turkish. You will be able to find figures. And another question posed by our dearest Professor Bedriye Porras, she asked a question about the Alevi women. This is a very important question because there is this allegation to be the ones who are supreme on the part of Sunnis, and they're imposing their own fate, and compulsory religion classes are only one part of it. And headscarf is not the only issue that creates victims, but this is one of the issues that we see as a result of instrumentalization of politics. But this also turns into the practice of exclusion. So this is not only a problem related to non-Sunnis. There are also so many discussions and problems experienced by Sunnis themselves. There is a great discrepancy and contradiction between the Sunni faith and also the presidency of religious affairs. So there are a lot of impositions on the part of the presidency on Sunnis too. I mean, this includes textbooks, civil society, and how freedom of religion or belief is restricted in many areas by the presidency. There are so many other examples that we can give here. Mine's question is really important. What would have changed if the senior management of the presidency of religious affairs would be women? What would have changed? Well, indeed, we need to have gender equality both in senior management and service delivery level. This is quite important. And of course, we can easily say that the presidency of religious affairs does not comply with the international standards here or international practice. But that really depends on so many other factors. For instance, how is secularism practiced in the country? But there is also another aspect. What is the actual demand of religious women or Muslim women? What do they demand from the authorities? How do they get organized? So in an authoritarian regime, even if a religious authority is governed by women, it can still be a problematic institution. I mean, so we cannot say that even if it's governed by women, it will inherently be good. We cannot say this, we cannot assert this, because there may always be women who are against the rights of women. Yet, if you're talking about demanding your own civic rights, and if women are capable of organizing this cause around their civic rights, women being equal citizens and having an equal share in governance, then this is different. Then this may allow us to see more equal interpretations of Sunni Islam. So all these Sunni women may bring about more equal practices, and they already exist in Turkey, they already exist around the world. And I think through their efforts, this can be overcome. And of course, Islam has more than one interpretation. Sunni Islam has more than one interpretation. So we don't need to have only a uniform way of interpreting or imposing Islam. So we can always have a religious authority that is different. By the way, I forgot to mention an important point. Considering today's circumstances and the opposition bloc made up of 6 political parties in Turkey, what makes their policies stand out? If we ask this question as to what stands out in terms of their policy, we can observe that they don't really talk much about this religious authority. They don't interfere much because one of the political parties in the opposition bloc has been very active in religious domain, and they were very active in lobbying for Turkey to pull out of the Istanbul Convention. We know that they indeed lobbied for that. So they want to keep their relations with their own constituency good. That's why they are not being strongly political about that. That's why, yes, this is one aspect of this gender backlash. Istanbul Convention has not been criticized, of course, with a strong argument. They have only provided a number of press statements. They only confined themselves to make some few press statements that once the opposition wins the elections and they hold the power, they will reverse this decision about the Istanbul Convention. That's the only thing that they said. However, of course, seeing this only as a matter of women's issue is just a manifestation of short-sightedness. I mean, this should indeed be a matter of vital politics, a matter of vital issue for the opposition too. Thank you very much, Professor Sancar. Dr. Petersen had to leave our webinar, our conference, because she had to attend another one. So I would like to now give the floor to Professor Sonneveld for her final remarks. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, these are very important and interesting questions, and of course they require a lot of thinking. So what I'm saying will be preliminary, but as for the minority groups within Turkish society and the imposition of Sunni official understandings on their religion or in their lives, sometimes it's not so. Yeah, sometimes this is also what minority groups are asking for, as we saw in the Egyptian case. So Egyptian Copts are at least large sections of this particular religious group is looking for Islamic divorce laws being applied to them, because they give them a lot more opportunities to divorce and to start their marital life again. And so you also see now that a few months ago, the Egyptian Copts were allowed to have their own inheritance, to practice their own inheritance system. And since men and women inherit equally, this, of course, is a provision that they would like to keep. And in prior to this, to 2022, that was not possible. So they had to be, they had to comply to Islamic rules on inheritance. And now you can imagine that there are Muslims who want these Coptic inheritance laws to be applicable to them. And to what extent is that possible? Well, the mere fact that you have to ask these questions, of course, is in a way, I think, wrong, because these types of things should be the same for all citizens, regardless of their religious affiliation. But that, of course, is a very political question, and one that is very difficult to solve. Also because when you're Professor Oder, when you're asking like, yeah, which approach should we adopt? Well, it basically is a political issue. So, I mean, the answer to the question, who has the authority to define how the principles of Islamic law or Islamic religion, Christian religion, Jewish religion, how they should be interpreted? Is that just one body? Or is there a possibility for a lot of different actors to express their own understandings of their religion and to have an open debate with a plurality of opinions? If that's no longer the case, then it becomes then the issue of gender and of religion is simply politicized, and then the way out is difficult. And finally, the question, like, if we would have female members in the presidency of religious affairs, would it be different? And I agree with Professor Sancar that having women does not necessarily change things. Together with my colleague Monica Lindberg, we edited the book on women judges in Muslim majority countries. And based on my own research on in Moroccan courthouses, interviewing both male and female judges, I don't see a big difference between male and female judges in family law issues, paternity cases in particular in Moroccan courthouses. But I do believe that women should be visible in the judiciary or in the presidency of religious affairs, simply because such bodies should reflect the composition of society. That's very important. So you feel you're kind of represented by these types of bodies, not necessarily by what they are saying. And I think I'll leave it for this.
Çok çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you very much.
Bir sorumuz daha var fakat çok uzattık. Belki bu soruyu daha sonra
Professor Sonneveld, we have one last question, but we don't want to take much of your time. I have already received a warning from the organizers that we went beyond our time, so we will get back to your question later in writing. I would like to thank you all very much for your attendance and to all the panelists for their presentations. We look forward to the upcoming presentations in the conference. Thank you.